Christopher Columbus died in pain. That's not the part we were taught in school. We got the poem, the dates, the heroic painting of a man in shining armor stepping onto a pristine beach with a flag. But the reality, the one that followed him all the way to his deathbed, was very different. By the time Columbus reached his 50s, his body was betraying him. His joints swelled, his legs burned and stiffened. Sometimes he couldn't even walk without help. Attacks came in waves, agonizing episodes that left him bedridden for days. For years, doctors called it gout, the disease of kings, a kind of ironic badge for a man who'd once been treated like a hero of empires. But if you look closer at his symptoms and at the timing, a darker possibility appears. Some historians now think Columbus might have been suffering from a form of reactive arthritis, a chronic condition triggered by infections, often sexually transmitted infections or diseases spread in crowded, unsanitary conditions. In other words, something he likely picked up on his voyages or in the brutal, chaotic colonies he founded, a body literally breaking down under the weight of the world he helped create. So the question is, how did we get from that man, lying in torment in a shabby house in Spain, to the sanitized version whose name ended up on parades, holidays, and kids' coloring pages? To answer that, we have to rewind, not to 1492. Further back, picture the world that made Christopher Columbus. He's born in Genoa, in what is now Italy, in the mid-1400s, into a family of wool weavers, not nobility, not royalty, just working people. He grows up near the Mediterranean, where the air smells like salt and tar and drying nets. Ships come and go constantly, carrying spices, silks, rumors, and fortunes. If you're a young man in that environment, you quickly learn that the real power in the world isn't the land under your feet. It's the trade routes. Who controls the sea, controls the money. By the time Columbus is a teenager, he's already working on ships, not as the clean, commanding figure from the paintings, but as a sailor, hauling ropes, climbing masts, dealing with storms and seasickness, and the constant risk of never coming back. Life at sea is dangerous. You face pirates, shipwrecks, disease. But it's also intoxicating. It's one of the only ways a man with no noble blood can get close to big power. Meanwhile, something else is happening in the background. The old overland trade routes to Asia, the Silk Road and its branches, are getting harder and more expensive to use. The Ottoman Empire has taken Constantinople. Tensions between Christian and Muslim powers make trade politically complicated. European elites are hungry for spices, gold, and luxury goods, but they want a way to get them without having to beg middlemen. So an idea begins to take shape in the minds of navigators and merchants. What if, instead of going east to reach Asia, you go west? Most educated people of the time know the earth is round. That part is a myth we tell kids, the idea that Columbus heroically proved everyone wrong and didn't sail off the edge. The real debate isn't about the shape of the planet, it's about the size of it. Columbus convinces himself the earth is smaller than most experts say. He believes Asia is much closer if you go west, and that there's a direct ocean route across what we now call the Atlantic. He's wrong about the distance, but he doesn't know that. He thinks he's found a shortcut that can make someone very rich. The problem is, he's just a mariner from Genoa. He doesn't have a fleet, or money, or royal blood, so he becomes something else, a salesman. And here's where we begin to see the first disturbing pattern. To sell his idea, Columbus makes promises, big ones. He goes from court to court, Portugal, then Spain, crafting a pitch. If you fund my voyage, he says, I will find a new route to Asia. I'll bring back gold, spices, silks, and access to markets that will make your kingdom rich. I'll claim new lands for the crown. I'll spread Christianity. In some versions of the pitch, he promises specific quantities of gold, specific time frames, as if he already knows what waits across the ocean. He doesn't, but he has to sound sure. Eventually, after years of rejection, Spain says yes. Ferdinand and Isabella, fresh from completing the Reconquista and pushing the last Muslim rulers out of Granada, are hungry for more glory, more wealth, more advantage over their rivals. Columbus gets his ships, his crew, and a contract. And that contract is important because it doesn't just say, go explore and report back. It promises Columbus titles and a cut of whatever he finds. He will be Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He will be Viceroy and Governor of all the lands he discovers. And he will get a percentage, usually described as a tenth, of all the wealth mined or collected from those lands. From the very beginning, this isn't just a voyage of discovery. It's a business venture with performance expectations. So, in 1492, Columbus sets sail. You know the names of the ships, Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, but it's worth pausing on something else, the mindset on board. They're not sailing into a blank void. They're sailing toward what they think is the East. The maps in Columbus's head are distorted, but they exist. He expects islands, coasts, eventually cities. He expects, above all, things to extract and send back: gold, slaves, spices. Weeks pass. The crew gets nervous. Supplies run low. At several points, they're near mutiny. Columbus has to juggle fear and authority, promising land and riches ahead, threatening punishment for troublemakers. Then, in October, they sight land. A beach, trees, people. Columbus goes ashore carrying banners, crosses, and the assumptions of a man who believes he's reached the outskirts of Asia. The people who live there, the Taino, have no idea what they're looking at. From their perspective, strange floating monsters appear on the horizon. Then smaller boats approach, filled with pale men in unfamiliar clothing, carrying metal weapons and symbols. These men speak a language they've never heard and make gestures that probably don't make much sense at first. Columbus, in his own writings, describes the Taino as generous, hospitable, and this is important, naked and unarmed. He notices their lack of metal weapons. He notes that they are timid and easily impressed by European trinkets. He also notes, very early on, that they would make good servants. On day one, the dynamic is set. This is not a meeting of equals. What happens next is often brushed past in the brave explorer version of the story. But if you read Columbus's own letters and logs, a pattern emerges. He takes some of the Taino captive almost immediately, ostensibly to serve as interpreters. He begins looking, obsessively, for gold. He misinterprets gestures and ornaments as signs of vast mineral wealth just out of sight. If someone wears a tiny gold ornament, he assumes there must be a mountain of it somewhere. He hops from island to island, convinced he's near Asia, misnaming everything in the process. The people he meets are folded into his imaginary geography. The Caribbean becomes the Indies, the inhabitants, Indians. The names stick for centuries. The first voyage returns to Spain with news, some captives, and small samples of gold and other goods. It's enough to trigger excitement, but not enough to satisfy the expectations Columbus himself created. So he goes back. The second voyage is much bigger. More ships, more men, and this time, less pretense that this is just about exploration. There are settlers now. There's livestock. There is, baked into the whole enterprise, the idea of building a colony that will generate profit. When Columbus returns to the region, he finds that the small fort he left behind has been destroyed and his men killed after they abused and exploited the local people. Instead of seeing this as a warning sign, he doubles down. He establishes a more permanent colony on Hispaniola. He imposes systems of tribute. Every Taino person above a certain age is expected to bring a quota of gold dust. Those who comply are given a token to wear. Those who fail face punishments ranging from floggings to mutilation to death. There isn't enough gold in the rivers and hills to satisfy these quotas. People are desperate. Some flee. Some resist. The Spanish respond with violence. Armed men on horseback, animals the Taino have never seen, ride through forests and villages as if they're invincible. Steel swords against wooden spears, musket fire against arrows. Entire communities are enslaved, relocated, or wiped out. Waves of disease follow. Smallpox, measles, influenza, pathogens the Europeans carry in their bodies, but to which the local population has no immunity. Death sweeps through villages before some people have even laid eyes on a European. Columbus is not a passive witness to this. He orders punishments. He approves violent crackdowns. When some of his own men complain that conditions are brutal and chaotic, that the colony is unstable, that the Taino are being treated with shocking cruelty, they write letters back to Spain. Those letters will eventually come back to haunt him. But at the time, the pressure he feels most intensely is economic. King and queen, investors, the people back home, they want results. The second voyage does not produce a flood of gold. So Columbus turns to something else he knows Spain will recognize as valuable: human beings. He begins shipping enslaved indigenous people back to Europe. This isn't some aberration in an otherwise noble career. It's part of the plan to make the colonies pay. He writes about it bluntly, about sending shiploads of people who can be sold. He also allows and participates in the distribution of women and girls to his men as concubines and sex slaves. For many of the Taino, the arrival of Columbus is not a colorful scene from a children's book. It's the beginning of the end. Over the next few decades, their population collapses. War, forced labor, starvation, and disease combine into something that many modern scholars are comfortable calling genocide, not in the sense of a single, centrally planned document ordering extermination, but as a lethal system that saw their lives as expendable and their land as a resource. Columbus is not the only architect of that system, but he is there at the beginning, helping shape the rules. And ironically, for all his violence, he's still not a very good administrator. As governor, he's erratic. At times, he's strangely lenient to certain allies, at other times, brutal. He makes enemies among his own people. Spanish colonists complain to the crown that he's corrupt, that he favors his family, that his rule is chaotic. Some of them, it's worth noting, aren't complaining because of the cruelty. They're complaining because the profits aren't what they were promised. Spain listens. Eventually, officials are sent to investigate. The complaints are serious enough that Columbus and his brothers are arrested, chained, and shipped back to Spain. There's a moment, one of those tiny, almost forgotten scenes in history, where this man, this admiral of the ocean sea, is literally in irons, being marched through the streets. He reportedly wears the chains voluntarily even after he could have removed them, claiming he wants to present himself to the monarchs exactly as he was treated, as a statement. Whether that's proud defiance or theatrical self-pity depends how you see him. The crown eventually frees him and restores some of his status, but his power never fully recovers. Other men, more politically savvy, more brutal, or simply more favored, take over the colonial administration. Columbus does make more voyages. He explores more of the Caribbean, reaches the coasts of Central and South America. But he never sets foot on what is today the mainland United States, despite the way later American myths would pull him into that story. His later years are marked by frustration. He feels cheated out of the rewards he was promised. He writes letters complaining that he hasn't received his share of the riches he helped open up. He insists to the end that he reached the outskirts of Asia, refusing to accept that he found something else entirely. And all the while, his body gets worse. Attacks of pain pin him to his bed, swollen joints, burning, stabbing sensations in his legs. He describes it as disabling. It's hard not to see a twisted kind of poetic justice in this. A man whose actions helped unleash catastrophic suffering finds his own world shrinking to the size of a room, maybe a single bed. His grand title's not worth much when he can't stand without help. We can't know for certain what exactly killed him. No autopsy, no lab work. Historical diagnoses are educated guesses at best. Gout is the traditional label. Too much rich food, too many feasts, the joints swelling with uric acid. The reactive arthritis theory paints a more unsettling picture. A body in chronic inflammation, triggered by infections that flourished in the unsanitary conditions of ships and colonies he created, or through sexual contact in a world where women, especially indigenous women, had little power to consent. In either case, his end is not dignified. He dies in 1506 in relative obscurity in Valladolid, Spain. No giant state funeral, no roaring crowds, no sense at that moment that his name will become shorthand for discovery in school textbooks centuries later. If the story had ended there, if he had just faded into the long list of ambitious, half-successful explorers, you and I probably wouldn't be talking about him. But history is never just what happens. It's also what we decide to remember. Fast forward a few centuries. The brutal realities of early colonization are still there in old letters, in reports, in the bones of people buried under church floors and in unmarked graves. But the world is changing. Empire after empire rises and falls. New nations are born in the Americas, including one called the United States. These new countries need founding stories. They need symbols. They need names to hold up as pioneers, pathbreakers, civilizers, even if the reality behind those names is complicated. Columbus is perfect for that job. He's European, Christian, and he sailed under a royal flag. But he's not English, which is politically convenient for young post-revolutionary America, trying to define itself as something different from Britain. His voyage in 1492 is far enough back that it feels almost mythic. And best of all, his story can be simplified, all the messy parts. Slavery, mutilation, misrule, chains can be quietly filed away. What's left is a neat package. He was brave. He defied the odds. He crossed an ocean. He discovered a new world. Never mind that millions of people already lived here. Never mind that other explorers had reached the Americas centuries earlier. Never mind that what he actually set in motion was less discovery and more invasion, followed by centuries of colonization. Those details are inconvenient when you're trying to build a clean national narrative. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, his legend starts to grow. Monuments are built. Poems and books paint him as a visionary who saw what others couldn't. Painters imagine scenes that never happened. Columbus kneeling on a beach in shining armor, thanking God while noble natives bow in awe. Schoolbooks trim away everything that doesn't fit the heroic mold. This is not accidental. Different groups in American society adopt Columbus for their own reasons. Some Catholic immigrants in the 1800s, facing discrimination, embrace him as an Italian Catholic hero in a Protestant-dominated country. Politicians use Columbus Day as a way to celebrate exploration, progress, and a vague sense of Western civilization. By the 20th century, children are reciting rhymes. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as if it's a harmless piece of trivia, not the opening line of one of the most dramatic and destructive encounters in human history. We're taught he proved the world was round. We're taught he was kind to the natives. We're taught the voyage was a heroic act of pure curiosity. Most of us are not taught that he enslaved thousands of people, that he ordered brutal punishments, that his administration was so chaotic and cruel that even other Spaniards were horrified. We're definitely not told about girls as young as 9 being sold to his men, or about families forced to fill impossible gold quotas. Those details start to surface more prominently in the late 20th century, as historians dig into primary sources and as indigenous voices get more space in the public conversation. Suddenly, Columbus stops looking like a one-dimensional hero and starts looking like something else. A man who sits at the hinge point between two worlds, whose actions help trigger both a massive cultural exchange and a catastrophe for the people on the receiving end. And that's where the debate today really is. There are still people who feel defensive about Columbus. They'll say he was a man of his time, as if that erases the specific choices he made. They'll say, if it wasn't him, it would have been someone else, which might be true but doesn't change what he did. They'll argue that focusing on his brutality is judging the past by modern standards. But here's the thing. There were people in Columbus's own time, priests, officials, even some fellow colonists who were appalled by what was happening, who wrote letters describing atrocities and condemning them. They didn't use the modern language of human rights, but they understood that torture, mass enslavement, and indiscriminate killing were wrong. So no, you don't need a 21st century mindset to see that something is horrifying. You just need to listen to the voices that were ignored when the myth was being built. The disturbing truth about Christopher Columbus isn't just about his personal cruelty. It's about what his story reveals about us. We took a complex, flawed, often ruthless man and turned him into a symbol of bravery and progress, then handed that symbol to children. We put his name on cities, rivers, holidays. We put statues of him in public squares. We wrapped an empire in the costume of a single heroic sailor and told ourselves a comforting tale. When those statues started coming down, sometimes by city council vote, sometimes pulled by protesters, you could feel the discomfort. It wasn't only about one man made of bronze. It was about what it means to admit that one of your founding heroes was also deeply implicated in atrocity. It feels like someone is reaching back into your childhood and saying, that story you loved? It was never that simple. There were bodies behind it. But facing that is not about self-hatred or erasing history. In a strange way, it's the opposite. It's about actually telling history instead of fairy tales. It doesn't mean pretending Columbus never existed or pretending the Columbian voyages didn't change the world. They absolutely did. They connected continents in a way that reshaped ecosystems, economies, and cultures on a planetary scale. Foods, animals, ideas, diseases, religions, technologies, all began to mix in ways that are still playing out. The disturbing part is that we encoded only one side of that collision into our public memory for so long. We memorialized the flag planting and the names of the ships, but not the chains, the whips, the screaming, the mothers watching their children taken away. We turned a man who died in pain, haunted by his own disappointments and blind spots, into a clean, triumphant icon. You don't have to strip away every nuance and call him a cartoon villain. He wasn't. He was an ambitious sailor in a world hungry for expansion and profit, someone who combined courage with greed, navigational skill with ruthless pragmatism, religious language with raw lust for status. A complicated human being. But once you accept that, it gets harder to keep celebrating him with parades. And that's why, in more and more places, you see something else happening. Instead of Columbus Day, some cities and states mark Indigenous Peoples Day. It's not about pretending Europeans never arrived. It's about shifting the center of gravity, saying, let's focus on the people who were already here, who endured this impact, who are still here today. Columbus becomes not a role model, but a case study, a warning, a reminder of how exploration can slide into exploitation when you see other humans as obstacles or assets instead of equals. If you zoom back in on that final image of Columbus, the man in pain, his joints swollen, his grand titles not protecting him against the breakdown of his own body, you might feel a complicated mix of things. Pity, maybe. Anger. A strange urge to say, look at what you unleashed. Look at how it broke you too. Because the world that grew out of Columbus's voyages wasn't gentle, not for anyone. It was a world of plantations and slave ships, of fortunes built and lost, of empires rising on the labor of people who didn't get to tell their side of the story. And that might be the most disturbing truth of all. It's not just that Christopher Columbus did terrible things. It's that we, for centuries, preferred the version of him that didn't. We liked the clean poster, the heroic rhyme, the brave sailor facing a scary ocean. We were willing to overlook the screams echoing from the forests of Hispaniola, the bodies piled up from forced labor and disease, the voices of indigenous people who remembered him not as a daring explorer, but as the beginning of disaster. But the record is still there, in the letters, in the logs, in the bones, and now, finally, more people are reading it. So the next time you hear that familiar line, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, you'll know the rest of the verse doesn't rhyme nearly as nicely. A man desperate for glory crossed an ocean. He found people, not empty land. He saw opportunity, not neighbors. He chose profit over mercy again and again. He died in pain, in a small room, in a body that refused to obey him, in a world already moving past him. And then, long after he was gone, we resurrected him, polished him, simplified him, and handed him to our children as a hero. Maybe the most important thing we can do now is very simple. Tell the story again. This time, we don't stop at the shoreline. We keep going, into the villages, into the mines, into the courts where he stood in chains, into the sick room where he lay, into the centuries of myth-making that followed. We don't erase him. We put him back where he belongs, not on a pedestal, but in context.